Well, I've taught many Bible classes, preached many sermons in Virginia on Sunday night. I was saying, well, I was just waiting. I know there's what's wrong with it, but I just a lot of my work went back. Sunday morning, I like to come tired.
She even gets mad at me for wearing your shorts on Sunday evening.
Well, that I haven't got it.
Well, they're not basketball shorts or anything. They're just, like golf shorts.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, she had great parents training her real. It's a little rough to do that. We get it. When I was in high school, I had to go to work after Canadian, so I would
Yeah.
bring my stuff and had to change in the bathroom.
Yep.
I remember the times you didn't wear pants. You wore a dress.
Oh, yeah.
You're a female.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think it's about time for us to get started this morning. I know that clock says 9:26, but I hear every Sunday morning, whoever's teaching class, say, that clock is slow. So I'm going to take them at their word this morning, and we'll go ahead and start. We are going to start a new series on Revelation, and I know that we had a mini-series a little over a month ago. We in fact, I squeezed a month of lessons into 2 months. And we'll probably do the same thing with the rest of the book, or at least a portion of the book. But we're going to start looking at Revelation today. And what I think we will do to begin with, for those of us that have forgotten, or those of us who maybe never heard to start with, I think we're going to do a majority of reviewing today, talking about Revelation, because it's imperative that you understand what Revelation is all about. You understand the background, you understand the style, you understand the audience, you understand all these things, because as we shall see, Revelation was written to a first century group of Christians, very, very relevant to every single one of us. But if you don't understand what they understood, you're not going to understand the significance of the book of Revelation. So we're going to talk about that today. And again, like I say, this may be redundant to some of you, and I apologize if that's the case, but I think it's imperative that we do go back and we review today. Now, in some of your Bibles, and certainly in older Bibles, there's another name for Revelation. What's it called? It starts with an A. The Apocalypse. What's the apocalypse? What's that word mean? It's a Greek term. What does that mean? What's an apocalypse? A prophetic vision. Technically, if you go back and you look at the derivation of the Greek word apocalypse, it means to be a revealing, hence the name Revelation. A revealing, an uncovering, a clarification, if you will. Now, the author, we're going to talk about him in just a moment, tells us in the first chapter the reasons he's doing this is because the Lord has directed him to talk to these first century Christians and to reveal something to them. And we'll talk about a little bit today what is so important for them to understand. And it's important for us to understand as well. And so he says, God told me to do this, and he's given me vision or prophetic wisdom to get this message across. And he gets it across in a very, very unique fashion that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Now, speaking of the author, who is the author? John. Okay, we know it's John. Why do we know it's John? Because he says it is. He says it. There are a lot of the books of the Bible that the author does not identify himself, but John says, I'm John. But we still got a little bit of problem in identifying John. Why? A whole bunch of Johns, right? John was a very, very popular name in the first century, just like it is today. He just says, I'm John. So how do we know which John? And we have to suppose a little bit of supposition involved here. How do we know which John this is? And that's kind of an important question as well.
Well, it was the John who was on Patmos.
Okay. He tells us that he is on Patmos, which is a little bitty island down the Aegean Sea, right across the shore from Ephesus. So it was probably, and this ties into what really gives us maybe the best clue. John doesn't identify himself to his first century Christian audience, the 7 churches of Asia that we studied in chapters 2 and 3. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But John only says, I'm John. Now, what do you think why would that give us a hint who this John is? Yeah. John assumes that they know who he is. He doesn't go into depth to identify himself as who he is. I'll give you a perfect example. I saw Bill earlier. I don't know where he is now, but I saw Bill earlier. When Bill Knowles gets up in the pulpit, does Bill say, my name is Bill Knowles, I lived here all my life. I'm married to Kay. I'm an elder here. Does he tell us that? No. Why? We know who Bill is, don't we? We look up there, we see Bill, we know who Bill Knowles is. We know his backgrounds. We know the great contributions he's made to this. We know he's Chuck's dad. We know all these things. We don't have to be introduced to him. And there's a whole lot of evidence that these folks in the first century in these 7 churches and the churches as a whole, they know who John is. Why would they know who John is? Why would he be a well-known figure in the first century? You're 100% right. He's written the gospel account of John. He's written 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. He's well known throughout the brotherhood in the first century. And so there's really no need in him trying to introduce himself. And I'm sure someone mentioned, Logan in fact mentioned he's on the Isle of Patmos. Probably that is circulated through the church. Why is he on Patmos, by the way? He tells us that. He's been exiled. The Romans are tired of fooling with him. And they ship him down there to this desert island in the middle of the Aegean Sea where he can't do any damage as far as they're concerned, any harm. So everybody probably knows who John is. Now, at this particular time, there seems to be no ambiguity about the authorship. In fact, for about 250 years, out to about 250 AD, there's no debate who he is. Are you familiar with the early church historian Irenaeus? That name mean anything to you? Irenaeus was a very, very prominent early church historian, and he writes and says unequivocally, this is the Apostle John. It wasn't until about 250 AD that anybody even questioned whether this was the same John. And the reason that they used, to me, can be easily explained. They said the Greek in the gospel account of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is somewhat different from the Greek that's used in Revelation. Now, can you think of a possible explanation why that is? Revelation is a little bit rougher, a little less grammatically correct, just not as smooth and as flowing as those other 4 works that we know the Apostle John wrote.
Is it because of the kind of writing it was?
It could be. It very definitely could be, because particularly there's a tremendous, and we'll talk about it today, there's a tremendous amount of reference to the Old Testament. A tremendous amount. Now, do you know what language the Old Testament primarily was written in? Hebrew. Very good. Hebrew does not translate well to Greek. And so it would be difficult to translate a whole lot of the Old Testament citations. And when we get into the text next Sunday morning, Lord willing, you're going to see, and we're going to go back and spend a lot of time in the Old Testament. A lot of time. Because there's so much of the Old Testament that is brought into Revelation. So it would be difficult for anybody to make that translation smoothly. Also, now this one I can really relate to. John, we'll talk about dating about AD 95. John had written the other four epistles, if you will, years before. Now I know this didn't apply to any of you, but it does to me. As the years go by, what tends to happen? I'm just not as proficient of a lot of things as I was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, it'd probably been around 10 years before that John wrote the majority of these other works. At this point, John is an old man. And, you know, well, to give you a classic example, I still have my notes on Revelation from when I was in college. And I pull them out. I've told you about studying, having the blessing of studying under Dr. Ian Fair. And I look at those notes, and I look at my penmanship, and I'm thinking, you know, I wrote pretty well. I write like a doctor now. Every time I sign my name on a credit card or something else, have my signature, D and gasp. They don't have any idea who that is. And she's right. She's 100% right. And so possibly age has played a role in it. And also, we know at this point of his life, he probably had scribes that were writing the majority of these letters to those 7 churches that we studied in chapters 2 and 3. So there's no doubt in my mind, despite the fact there's some of the scholars that question it, that John is the author, the Apostle John. Now, why does that give us a little bit of reassurance?
He spent all that time with Jesus.
Very good.
Because he saw it. He lived it.
Very good. In fact, according to first century church history, he's the only apostle that's still alive. In fact, all the other apostles have died violent deaths at the hands of the Romans. And so he is really the most authoritative source left for Christians then and for us today. And so I don't know about you, but that's kind of reassuring to me. Now, one of the traits of the style of writing, the genre of writing, in fact, let me just ask a question. What is the style of writing or the genre of writing in Revelation? What's it called? Apocalyptic. Now, there's some certain things you have got, well, I say you, we have got to understand about apocalyptic language to thoroughly understand the book of Revelation. And why do we need to understand the book of Revelation? You know, the sad thing is, of all the books of the Bible, the 66 books, I dare say Revelation is probably the most neglected one of all of them. And why is that? Why do people shy away from Revelation? I'm sorry? Don't understand it. That's very true. They don't understand the style that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And hey, listen, if you don't understand the style, just bottom line is A, it's non-understandable, and B, it's scary. Because there's dragons, and there's sea creatures called Leviathan, and there's land creatures called the Behemoth, and there's all kinds of gore, and all kinds of horror, and all kinds of debauchery. I mean, it's a scary book if you don't understand what's going on. And you've really got to understand a few things that we're about to talk about. But why would we even need to understand about something that was written AD 95, you know, nearly 3,000 years ago? Why would we need to understand and dig into the book of Revelation?
Because the message is God wins.
Very good. 2 Timothy 3:16 says, for all Scripture is inspired or God-breathed. It's there and is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God might be complete or equipped for every good work. It's good for you. It's good for you. And we understand that. You remember, Paul tells the church of Rome in the 4th chapter, verse 15. We've talked about this many times. What do you need to study? All of God's Word? Okay, that's what Paul says to Timothy. That's exactly right. Study, show yourself approved, a workman who has no need to be ashamed, rightly dividing or handling the word of truth. We don't understand Revelation. Can we accurately handle it? No. But Paul says to the church of Rome, he says that the things that were written in the past were written for your instruction, that you might have, and I love this because this gets right to the root of Revelation, you might have what? Hope. You might have hope. Some of your translations say assurance. In other words, we need to understand Revelation, folks, because there is a wealth of information there. There's a wealth of knowledge. There's a wealth of comfort. There's a wealth of support. And there's a wealth of understanding. And if we don't study it in a way that it was intended, we're going to miss all that. Now, in order to understand Revelation, and I didn't until I had, again, the blessing of studying under Dr. Ian Fair. I didn't understand a whole lot. In fact, didn't really understand any of the nature, what he called the nature of apocalyptic language. And there's several things we've got to grasp before we can really understand it. Number one, we have got to understand that it is very, very figurative. Very figurative. Very, very symbolic. And the second thing we've really got to understand is all that symbolism, all of that figurative language was well understood by that first century audience. They understood it. And I used this example way back when we first started chapters 2 and 3 and given a very similar introduction to Revelation. If I said to you that it's raining cats and dogs, how many of us are going to jump up and run out and look out the window and expect to see felines and canines falling out of the sky? No. No, when I say it's raining cats and dogs, the vast majority of us would understand what? Raining hard. You know, when I was a kid, another good old country saying that I understood completely, never questioned, and probably a lot of you understand too. If you're going to somebody's house for lunch, they say, come on over, we've put on the dog. A lot of people, if you tell them this day and age, somebody putting on the dog, they don't want to go. But when we hear that, we heard that, particularly old country boy like me, what'd that mean? Man, they're putting on lots of good food, a good feed. That's exactly right. And you know, the list goes on and on and on and on. Well, basically everything that was said in Revelation was well-known symbolism or had some ties to that first century. So it's obvious the key for us to understanding the message is to go back and do some research and understand what did that symbolism mean? What did it mean? And secondly, and I've already alluded to this, Revelation is deeply steeped in the Old Testament, particularly Old Testament prophecy, particularly in a couple of the books of the Old Testament. Anybody know which ones? There's lots of apocalyptic language in a couple of the books. Okay, Daniel and Ezekiel, that's 100% right. They're big chunks of Daniel and Ezekiel. In fact, we'll, Lord willing, refer to particularly Ezekiel next week in that 4th chapter. And we'll go back to Joel next week, and we'll go back throughout a whole lot of the Old Testament. This Old Testament prophecy, again, it's explained oftentimes in the Old Testament. And particularly for the Jewish Christian, if they read that same symbolism, they think, oh yeah, The prophet Ezekiel talked about that in a real troubled time, very similar to what's going on in Revelation in that first century with the Romans. Or, oh yeah, I remember Joel talking about that. Or I remember, of course, they knew the Bible, unfortunately, better than most of us did, the scriptures. But they knew all these things. And the Gentiles that maybe weren't as familiar with it, it could be explained to them, this is what it means. And so we've got these facts, the reason that people just don't understand Revelation, because they don't understand the symbolism, they don't understand the historic value. That's why I think I love it so much, being a historian. I love to go back and look at the history that's going on. And once you get it and once you see it, you understand it. And speaking of history, another very important thing for us to understand, to fathom, is to understand when Revelation was written. And there's some among scholars, there's some debate among them about exactly when it was written. Some, we know from the context, and we know from the early church historians like Irenaeus, that it was a time of tremendous persecution that was going on. And so that helps us, gives us a little bit of a clue when we go back historically and look at what's going on. And the first name that comes up, the first emperor's rule that comes up when we think about persecution, was the Emperor Nero. Y'all remember Nero? Nero ruled from the end of the AD 56 through AD 65. Nero started out not so bad, but it's pretty obvious Nero had some mental issues. And I've shared with you before, his most famous thing, or infamous thing, that Nero ever did was what? He burned Rome. Now, he didn't mean to burn Rome. As I've said, I think several months ago when I said this, he was practicing what he might have considered urban renewal. He's going to burn the slums down so that Rome looks good. And he's the emperor that's done all this. And so he has them set a fire in an area called Donkey Flats that was primarily where the Christians lived, primarily the Jewish Christians. The thing that Nero did not understand, apparently he hadn't been watching Pete Delkus on WFAA that morning, the wind shifted. And when it burned down approximately 70% of the whole city of Rome. Well, Nero could not admit, I did this. I mean, he's trying to work on his reputation. And so he blames the Christians. That's where it started. And he launches a massive persecution. There's just one problem with dating Revelation during Nero's reign in the AD 60s. Most of the persecution against the Christians was centrally located right there in and immediately around Rome. Now we know from Revelation that persecution has gone on into Asia Minor and expanded really all over the empire. So it's important maybe to find a different time frame. And again, Irenaeus, he tells us point blank, this happened in another emperor's reign. The next emperor that really had a major persecution was an emperor named Vespasian. And Vespasian, his persecution was pretty intense, but nothing compared to his follower. And his follower was Domitian. And Domitian ruled from the late AD 80s to AD 95, which is when most scholars this day and age say it's pretty clear, and Irenaeus had said it, about AD 95 is when this is written. So we go back and we look historically and say, what was going on in the Roman Empire in AD 95, the very end of the first century? And the persecution, when we think about the persecution of Christians, this was the dead center. Christians being thrown to the lions, Christians being burned at the stake, Christians being imprisoned, Christians being thrown out of the Roman Empire like John was on Patmos. The persecution was horrible. And Domitian, just much like Nero had been 30 years before, he obviously, the longer he reigned, the more mentally unstable he became. And the more of a horrific persecution he launched against Christians. Eventually, it gets so bad that even the Romans, they assassinate him. and end his reign. So we've got to keep that in mind too, and particularly keep in mind what's going on when he makes these allusions historically in Revelation. And by the way, there's a term that scholars really do like. They call it the rebirth of imagery, which that's pretty well self-explanatory. What is the rebirth of imagery? Give you a quick example. Many times in Revelation, there's reference to Babylon. Now, when Babylon was mentioned, particularly to the Jews, what did they think of? I'm sorry? The worst, yeah. In 586 BC, the third of the invasions came in to Israel, and the ones they didn't kill, they carted them off in exile. And so when the word Babylon was mentioned, people cringed. Well, oftentimes, particularly as we get on to the middle part of Revelation, it's talking about Babylon the Great. Now, obviously, Babylon's been gone for years and years and years. It's been overthrown by the Medo-Persian Empire 700 years before. What does he mean, Babylon? Well, he's talking about the persecution launched against God's people. And now it's not Babylon, it's who? It's Rome. Yeah, it's Rome against the Christians. But they understood when they're talking about Babylon the Great, they're talking about the Roman Empire. And so it's very important for us to understand that as we go through, because a lot of people, as Mary, as you said, they won't take it literally. Oh, Babylon, which is basically where the Iranians are now, the Iraqis. They're going to rise up, they're going to overthrow the United States of America and blah, blah, blah. No. That's not what he's talking about. Well, we do know there's persecution against Christians, and we do know that Satan's going to precipitate all this, but he's not talking about actual nation of Babylon. They've been gone for thousands of years. Okay, I've done all the talking so far this morning. Anybody want to make a comment? Maybe something I've left out? I've got my notes here. It's not so I have something to say. It's so it'll make me be quiet. If I... You know, you're one of the very few people that ever told me that. In fact, many years ago, I was teaching a history class for Western Texas College. I taught for them for 10 years. And one night at the Stanford Cowboy Reunion Rodeo, I'm taking one of the boys to the concession stand or the bathroom or somewhere, and I'm walking down behind the stands. You got my boot, my hats, just me. We're walking along, and this guy walks up to me and says, "Excuse me, are you Greg Melton?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the Greg Melton who teaches for Western Texas College?" "Yes." He said, "Mister, I hope I never hear your voice again." Now, that was back in the old days when the old me viewed that as fighting words, particularly at the rodeo. I said, "I beg your pardon." He said, No. He said, "I'm not being ugly." He said, "My wife is in your history class. And she records it." Well, I knew who he was talking about because she sat on the front row, great student, recorded everything, a little cassette recorder. And he said, and then she'll come home, because we only had class once a week, it's a summer course, and she'll listen to your lecture over and over and over. He said, "I don't mean to be ugly, but I don't want to hear any more of your lecture." I said, "Hey, buddy, I understand completely." Well, of course, it mortified his wife. She came to class the next month. I think it was a Thursday night class or whatever. Come to class and just, "I'm so sorry. I said, "No, I understand." So some of you, before we get through with Revelation, maybe you felt the same way. So I would strongly suggest just tell one of the elders, and they can say, "Hey, we'll take a break for a while," or that's enough Revelation. Now let's talk a little bit. There are several very, very important in the time that we have remaining Very, very important messages in Revelation. One of which is that God knows what's going on. You remember back when we studied in Revelation, the 2nd chapter, the second church, in fact, again, if you'll remember, there was this horseshoe postal road that went up there in what's Asia Minor today, Turkey right now. It started down here with Ephesus and went up, and then it turned south. And there were 7 cities there, 7 churches. And that's who John says, this is who these letters are written for. And remember we said there were only 7 of them, which a lot of people say that constitutes a problem. Why? How can you have a message for Christians if you only have 7 churches? Because we know what? There were a whole lot more. There's Colossae, there's Troas, there's Rome, there's Corinth. And, there's all these places that aren't mentioned. And you all remember, and this is where some of that symbolism comes in. Why would there only be 7 mentioned? There were 7 real churches. The churches were symbolic. The cities were real.
They were some representative of all of the congregations, things that were going wrong.
Very true. Very true. Remember, he talks about number 1. He talked about the strong points, and then he talked about the problems with 5 of the 7. 2 of them he didn't find any problem. Chuck?
I think at that time, that you're looking at symbolism again, because 7 was a preferred number. It was a good number. It was something that they revered as having good luck. So 7 had a whole lot of symbolism. And so, like you said, they understood that too.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about 7 churches and the diversity between the 7, the message is it's for all of you. It's good.
Very good. 7 represented in that day, they called it numerology. And throughout, not just for Christians, but throughout the ancient world, 7 represented completeness, totality. And it was a perfect number. And so when Jesus has a message for 7 churches, it's for everybody. And as pointed out so very well, he talked about really every positive and every negative you could find in any churches, including, if you'll recall, when we studied before, Saginaw. I mean, it's very, very relevant to everybody. But as he goes through, he says to each one, if you'll remember, the very first remark he made to all 7 churches, I know your works. What does that mean? Yeah, I know what's going on. He knew all the good, he knew all the bad, or 5 of the 7 anyway. He knew all the good things, because to each one of them he said something good to them too. God knows. God knows your situation. And think about it. We speculate, do you think any of these first century Christians are struggling with what's going on? Struggling with all the persecution and all the horrors that are going on? You think any of them are struggling with that? Any of us sometimes say, why is this happening? And there's that little sneaking suspicion that creeps in the back of your mind. God, do you know what I'm going through? Do you understand why I'm suffering? Do you understand what's going on? I know I sure have. I know I have. I hate to admit it, but I have. Well, I feel like these people are going through the same thing. And there's a clear message as we go through Revelation. Hey, God knows what's going on. And he knows that many of you are still faithful. And a second, and this is a big, big one. You're going to win. You're going to win. It doesn't matter what Domitian does, or what Vespasian did, or what Nero did, or what the Babylonians did 3,000 years ago. If you are a child of God, you're going to win. That's the beauty, the real beauty of the book of Revelation. It was true in the first century. It's true today in Saginaw. When we deal with difficult times, Revelation is going to tell us, as it told them 2,000 years ago, regardless of what's going on, you're going to win. You're a winner. And I try, when I really get down, and we're not going to have Dan to give us a testimonial here of how I really get down. I try, after I clear my head a little bit, to sit down and to read something out of Revelation. Because I know whatever I'm going through is nothing compared to they. And they still won. And several weeks ago, we had the privilege of bringing the message. We went back to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, the final few verses of the 11th chapter. He's been talking about all these heroes of faith and how they've triumphed, and then he gets down verses 31 and following, and says, but some of these people were, quote, sawn in two. Some of them were put in shackles. Some of them were exiled out into the wilderness and lived in caves and suffered. And I'm thinking, I'm sure the Hebrew brethren and Greg wondering, how's that victorious? And then at very last verse of that 11th chapter, he says, God's had something better than what's in his life. He has something better. So it doesn't matter what happens. And if you remember in Revelation 2nd chapter, verse 10, the latter part of that verse, he tells this little church of Smyrna that's going through more persecution apparently than anybody. We went back historically and looked at that. He says, but you be faithful even unto death, and I'll do what? I'll give you a crown of life. And the Greek word that's translated crown here is Stephanos, which means a victor. You'll have the woven laurel wreath. You're a victor. You're the winner. You're triumphant. And that message is so clear in Revelation. You just hang in there, or again, Revelation 2:10, you just hang in there, and you're going to be victorious. And so, when we get down, because we're just pretty close to being out of time. When you get right down to it, in chapter 1, verse 3, John says, here's why you need to understand exactly what Revelation is saying. In fact, let's just turn over there and let's just read that. Because he says you're going to be blessed if you do this. Verse 3 of chapter 1. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of prophecy and who heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. Now the word blessed, again, it's a Greek word that's used here. Typically, most of us, how would we translate blessed or blessed in our vernacular today? Happy, yeah. But that word goes a whole lot further in the Greek word that's used. It is a euphoric sense of victory. And he says that if you, first thing he said, you read these words, and then you do what? You hear these words, okay, and then you do what? Okay. Again, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of prophecy and heed the things which are written in them. Now, if you look at all three of those, when he says that you hear these words, what does that mean? We'd say read today. You read them, you listen to them, and then what'd you say? Yeah, they hear these words, and then you do them. Yeah, that's where the heed comes in. You got to hear them, and then secondly, you incorporate them in your mind, and then thirdly, you do it. It's kind of like I've told this story. I don't know if I told it here or not, but I was a kindergarten principal for 10 years, the end of my education career. Best 10 years of my education career. I had a teacher one day brought in a little boy, and she wants him sitting outside the office. She said, Mr. Melton, I want you to get his attention. He doesn't pay any attention at all in class. He just kind of ignores me. He goes on, does his own thing. Would you please get across to him that he has got to pay attention and do what I ask him to do? I said, sure. So I invited him to come in. I collected militaria as a historian, and I had my office all full of all kinds of militaria. Well, while I'm trying to talk to him, he's which is part my fault for having all that in there, I guess. But he's looking around, and finally I thought, I'm going to get this little rascal's attention. And I popped my hand down on the desk, and I said, do you hear me? Now, what was I asking him? Are you listening? Are you paying attention? Are you going to do what I said? And his response tickled me to death. He said, of course I hear you. You're loud. Well, every time I read that chapter 1, verse 3, I think that, that, or physically hearing the words, but John says you don't just hear them, you incorporate them in your minds, and then you do them. And we go back to what we talked about earlier. If we don't correctly interpret Revelation, that's going to be very, very hard for us to do. Very difficult for us to do. And so I'd say that, I'm really excited. I hate to confess this, but sometimes I cringe a little bit before I start because it takes a lot of study and a lot of research to accurately either understand or to teach this lesson. But every time I do it, I don't know how many times I've taught it, I'm very, very excited about it. And I hope it means a lot to you. And like I say, get tired of it, let one of the elders know, and they'll shut me down. Talking about, we got a couple minutes, I'll tell this story. Dr. Ian Fair, a magnificent scholar, he talked about one day in class, when he first came to Abilene, he's from South Africa, and spoke with this South African brogue. I loved it. And he said when he first came to Abilene, he taught at Abilene Christian, he said that he was asked to go out and preach at a little country church somewhere and talk about country statements. He said, I can't mock his or mimic his South African drawl, but he said, a good brother asked me in his prayer to start with to give me a ready recollection. Now, most of us country folk, and particularly the older ones, we know what a ready recollection was. But Dr. Fair said, it nearly knocked me out of the pew. I didn't know what a ready recollection was, and this brother is praying for me to have a ready recollection. A, I didn't know whether I wanted it or not. And B, I didn't even know how I'd know if I got it or not. He scared me to death, but he said, later on he figured out what it meant. So I just pray through this that I have a ready recollection of what I've studied for the last 50 years, and hopefully I can portray it. Thank y'all very much for being here. I will mention this. You might be sure and bring your Bibles or your electronic devices, however you read God's Word, because again, we are going to spend quite a bit of time going back to the Old Testament and looking at various and sundry concepts that again, he's going to practice this rebirth of imagery. Thank y'all very much.